The men who built the most admired muscle of the last century did it on food that would look like almost nothing today. In 1949, a Tennessee farmer weighing 181 pounds pulled 725 pounds off the floor of a city auditorium. But the version of that story we keep repeating in gyms has a hole in it. In Leeds that year, a young Englishman was shaping a Mr. Universe body while meat was still rationed, and his weekly food coupons say something the photographs don't. So, what were these men actually eating? Johnson City, Tennessee, March of 1949. Bob Peoples was 39 years old and farmed in Carter County. He'd been born there in 1910, which meant his teenage years ran straight through the Great Depression, and the equipment in his basement reflected it. His gym was built from 2x4s, 55-gallon drums packed with scrap iron and concrete, and whatever else the farm could spare. Paul Anderson, later billed as the strongest man in the world, called that basement the dungeon. That March, at the Red Shield Boys Club variety show in the Johnson City Auditorium, Peoples walked out in front of a hometown crowd, wearing a lifting belt and chalk and nothing else. He loaded a standard bar with a mismatched collection of plates and deadlifted 725 3/4 pounds at a body weight of 181. 4 times what he weighed, lifted in front of neighbors who had known the Peoples farm since he was a boy. Officials reweighed the bar on the auditorium floor before anyone could celebrate, because 2 years earlier his first 700-pound record had come back a pound light. That record stood in the light heavyweight class until 1972, but the man the crowd applauded that night had built himself somewhere far less dignified. He trained alone in the dungeon, worked physical labor through the day, and came down the cellar stairs at night. Nobody paid him a penny for any of it. Along the way, he built an early wooden version of the power rack out of timber and scrap, invented the lifting strap because his grip kept giving out on repetition deadlifts, and kept a training ledger that begins on the 1st of November, 1935. By the time he set the record, he had squatted well over 500 pounds in that same cellar and cleaned over 300. All of it trained between chores on a working farm. That original rack and barbell now sit in a university collection in Texas. So, how does a farmer in Carter County walk onto an auditorium stage and pull 4 times his own body weight in the middle of the Great Depression? Every part of that story gets retold in gyms today. The part that rarely gets retold is what sat on the kitchen table upstairs. That silence is where the legend lives. A man in overalls, a barn, a bar, and the unspoken suggestion that he ate whatever was going and grew strong anyway. It's a story about virtue as much as a story about muscle, and it's been repeated in so many gyms that hardly anyone checks it against the paperwork. When you do check it, the trail leads to a magazine office in Philadelphia, 17 years earlier. In 1932, a coach named Mark Berry was writing about heavy squats in Alan Calvert's Strength magazine. Berry argued that high-repetition squatting built more size across the whole body than any other movement in the gym, and testimonials started arriving from readers who'd tried it. One of those readers was a lifter from Illinois named Joseph Curtis Hayes. Hayes wrote to Berry to report what had happened to him. Working with a barbell, a squat rack braced against a shed wall, and the press behind the neck, he claimed he'd gained close to 30 pounds in a single month. 30 pounds of body weight in 30 days on a homemade rack behind a shed. Could that possibly be true? Berry corroborated the figure in print. Within a year, Hayes was famous in every barbell club in America, and the 20-rep squat became the standard prescription for any thin young man who wanted to grow. That method was crude. Take a weight you could handle for 10 repetitions on the squat. Then force yourself to 20. Standing upright under the bar between the last 10 reps, and taking 3 deep breaths before each one. Heiser said that after one honest set, you should feel as though you'd just run 2 miles flat out. Perry Rader carried the method into Iron Man magazine, where it stayed in print for decades and reached a generation of teenagers training in basements and garages across America. But here's the detail that the retelling always edits out of the Heis story. He didn't build himself on scraps, he force-fed. The program was never the barbell alone. It was heavy squats bolted to bread, eggs, fruit, and milk in volumes that would frighten a modern kitchen. And over the following years, Heis grew from a slight man into a lifter of nearly 300 pounds. The advice that traveled alongside the barbell was to drink milk until you couldn't face another glass, then pour another one. So the first great scarcity legend in American strength turns out to be a story about eating more than everyone around you. Think about that for a moment, because it sets the pattern for everything that follows. Which brings us to the one place where the food really was controlled, measured, and stamped in a book. In January of 1940, the British government introduced food rationing. Every man, woman, and child received a ration book, registered with a particular butcher and grocer, and lived inside a weekly allowance. A typical adult ration ran to 4 ounces of bacon or ham, 2 ounces of cheese, 2 ounces of butter, 4 ounces of margarine, 3 pints of milk, 8 ounces of sugar, and meat to the value of about 1 shilling and tuppence, which is roughly 2 chops. It's easy to assume the pressure lifted when the war ended. It didn't. Bread had never been rationed during the fighting, and it went on the ration in July of 1946. Bacon allowances were halved that October. Potatoes were rationed in 1947, after a brutal winter wrecked the harvest. Tea stayed on the ration until 1952. Meat, the last item of all, didn't come off until the 4th of July. 1954, 9 years after the shooting stopped in Europe. Rationing outlasted the war by longer than the war itself had lasted. That's the Britain Reg Park was training in. So what does a Mr. Universe body look like when it is built inside that system? Park was born in Leeds in June of 1928, a footballer first, good enough to sit on the reserve list at Leeds United. At around 16, he met a local strongman called David Cohen and started lifting in a Yorkshire back garden. National service made him a physical training instructor in Singapore. When the Army discharged him in 1948, he went to watch the first NABBA Mr. Universe contest in London, saw John Grimmick edge out Steve Reeves in front of an argumentative crowd, and left that hall knowing exactly what he wanted. In 1949, after roughly a year of serious training with a barbell, a pair of dumbbells, and a chinning bar behind his parents' house, Park won Mr. Britain. In 1950, he stood on the Mr. Universe stage against Steve Reeves and weighed in at 215 pounds to Reeves' 225. Reeves took the title. But Park went home to Leeds and trained, by his own account, 3 hours a day, and took the 1951 contest as the first non-American ever to hold it. All of that happened with a ration book sitting in the kitchen drawer. It's a good story, and most of what Leeds remembers about Park holds up, which is exactly why the small print matters. Look closely at what those coupons restricted. Bread, potatoes, and vegetables were the floor of the British diet rather than the luxury. And outside the 2 years of bread rationing, they were broadly on the shelf. What the ration book controlled was bacon, cheese, butter, sugar, and meat. The foods that made a plate satisfying rather than the foods that made it sufficient. British civilians were rarely short of raw energy. They were short of variety, short of fat, and short of anything on the table that tasted like abundance. Then there's the matter of Park's own circumstances. His parents paid for a 6-month trip to the United States as a gift after the 1949 win, and he trained in American gyms on American food while Britain was still counting coupons. He ate eggs by the dozen whenever he could get them, and eggs from your own hens in your own back garden were never counted against anybody's book. Plenty of Yorkshire households also did quiet business with a man who knew a man. None of that makes Park less impressive. It makes Park someone operating inside the ration system, rather than a saint who rose above it. But if you want the clearest case of the whole pattern, you have to leave Europe entirely. Nearly 5,000 miles east of Leeds, in the wrestling pits of Amritsar, another physique was being built on what looks from the outside like peasant food. Ghulam Mohammed Baksh was born in 1878, and the world came to know him as the Great Gama. From about the age of 10, his daily work in the Akhara ran to 500 bethaks, a deep squat performed up on the toes, and 500 dans, a diving push-up that folds the whole spine through every repetition. He dug the floor of the wrestling pit with a heavy iron blade to keep the earth soft under the wrestlers. As he grew, the numbers grew with him, up to 3,000 bethaks and 1,500 dans in a single day, alongside wrestling sessions against 40 men in rotation. For road work, he ran a mile through the streets with a stone ring weighing 120 pounds around his neck. Gama never lost a match across a career spanning roughly 50 years. And Bruce Lee later lifted the bethak and the dans straight from magazine articles written about him. So what was fueling all of that? The American anthropologist Joseph Alter, who spent years inside North Indian wrestling culture, researching his book The Wrestler's Body, recorded the daily intake of a court wrestler at Gama's level. Around 10 liters of milk, half a liter of ghee, 3/4 of a kilogram of crushed almond paste whipped into a tonic drink, 2 kilograms of fruit, meat and yakni, a long boiled extract of bones and tendons, added to the plate once he'd turned 15. That's not scarcity. It's one of the most calorie-dense diets any athletic culture has ever produced, assembled from milk, fat, and nuts, because those were the foods a wrestling patron could supply in quantity to a wrestler in an earth pit. 3 stories on 3 continents, and underneath every one of them, a single shape. Minimal equipment paired with maximal food. In each case, the thing that looked scarce was the variety on the plate rather than the sheer amount of it. By the autumn of 1944, in a red brick laboratory in Minneapolis, a very different question about food was about to be answered properly for the first time. Ansel Keys was a physiologist at the University of Minnesota and a consultant to the War Department. Allied units moving into occupied Europe were finding civilians who'd survived for years on bread, potatoes, and very little else. And nobody knew how to feed those people back to health without killing them. So Keys proposed something blunt. Take healthy young men and starve them under observation. The recruitment brochure went out across the civilian public service camps in May of 1944, with one line on the cover: "Will you starve that they be better fed?" More than 400 conscientious objectors volunteered. 36 were selected, and on the 19th of November, 1944, they walked into the Laboratory of Physiological Hygiene, carrying their own suitcases. For 12 weeks, they ate a controlled diet of roughly 3,200 calories a day, while researchers measured everything about them. Then came 24 weeks of semi-starvation on about half that, built from potatoes, turnips, pasta, and wholemeal bread to mirror what Europe was living on. The men kept walking roughly 22 miles a week and kept working in the laboratory throughout, They lost about a quarter of their body weight. Muscle wasted visibly off their frames. Resting metabolic rate fell. Body temperature dropped, and fluid began pooling in the volunteers' lower legs. Grip strength collapsed in the laboratory tests, and so did their capacity for work. Several of the volunteers developed anemia. The psychological record is harder to read than what the scale showed, because these were resilient men chosen for their stability, and they became irritable, withdrawn, and incapable of thinking about anything except food. They read cookbooks in their bunks, collected recipes they had no way to cook, and stretched a single plain meal out across hours. Keyes published the whole study in 1950 as a 2-volume work called The Biology of Human Starvation, 1,300 pages long, and it remains the fullest record anyone has of what deprivation does to a healthy human body. Recovery proved just as instructive. The men needed months of eating far above their old normal before their frames came back, and full psychological repair took years. So the question the legend keeps dodging has a documented answer, sitting in a Minnesota archive. Men living on next to nothing don't build muscle. Men lose it, along with their strength, their body heat, and eventually, their personalities. If you're enjoying this kind of history, the sort where the record and the legend don't quite line up, subscribing is the simplest way to keep finding it. There's more of this coming, including the decade when American gym owners decided the barbell was finished. Which forces a better question? If real scarcity dismantles a physique, what was happening in all the cases where men clearly did build something on very little? The clearest modern case was born on a farm outside Wrightsville, Georgia. Herschel Walker was an overweight child with a stammer who took a beating from other boys at school, and after 6th grade he asked his brother's track coach what to do about it. That coach told him to do push-ups, sit-ups, and sprints. Walker took that instruction more literally than anyone has taken an instruction before or since. He did push-ups and sit-ups in the thousands every day, banging out sets on the living room floor during television commercial breaks until the count ran into the hundreds by bedtime. The sprints happened on ground his father had just plowed, because the loose soil dragged at his feet like sand. He chased the family horse across the field and cut when it cut, building his own change of direction. There was a chin-up bar behind the house. Beyond that, he wrestled his brothers, hauled hay, and took up taekwondo in a small-town gym. He didn't lift weights, not in high school and not at the University of Georgia, where he won the Heisman Trophy in 1982. When the coaching staff finally tested him on the bench press, a lift he'd essentially never trained, he pressed 375 pounds, which his coach said was the most anyone at Georgia had managed to that point. Then there is the food. Walker has said for decades that he eats 1 meal a day in the evening, and that the meal is soup, bread, and salad. He avoids red meat. He told CNN plainly that he doesn't worry about protein, that he grew up in South Georgia and nobody on those farms worried about protein or cholesterol either. Pay close attention to this next part, because it explains why the story travels so well and why it misleads the men who repeat it. Walker is a physical outlier of the kind that turns up a handful of times in a generation. He was a full-time professional athlete for decades. Every one of those numbers sits on top of a childhood of farm labor and daily volume that very few people could sustain for a month, let alone 40 years. Walker is also, by his own description, eating a real meal at the end of every single day. The story is true. What people pull out of it usually isn't. That same pattern shows up in the prison yard, which is where this argument ends up in every gym conversation eventually. In the late 1990s, California removed weightlifting equipment from its penitentiaries, and similar restrictions spread through other state systems. Men who'd been training with iron went back to the concrete floor and the pull-up bar, and a great many of them stayed visibly muscular on institutional food. It looks like proof that the food never mattered. So why does it work? Look at the conditions instead of the tray. Training happens in the yard every single day because nothing else competes for the time. Sleep is enforced by the schedule. Alcohol is largely absent. That same handful of movements gets repeated at high frequency for years. The one training variable that reliably beats novelty. Tray food is monotonous and unappealing, and it's also constant, timed, and never short on calories. That combination of relentless consistency and undisturbed recovery is doing work the prison food keeps getting credited for, which is roughly where the modern laboratory research lands as well. Building muscle while losing fat at the same time is possible, and researchers have demonstrated it in controlled trials more than once. It's also far narrower than the gym folklore suggests. Recomposition shows up most reliably in lifters new to the gym, in people returning to the bar after a long layoff, and in people carrying more body fat, because all three groups have either an unusually strong response to the training stimulus or a large energy reserve to draw on. The most cited trial in this area put young men in a substantial deficit with a high protein intake and 6 days a week of hard training. And they did add lean tissue while losing fat across 4 weeks. Deep deficits held for months, by contrast, suppressed the whole process rather than accelerating it, which is precisely what those 36 men in Minneapolis demonstrated 80 years ago. Nothing in that literature describes a shortcut. It describes a narrow window held open by hard training and enough food that closes the moment the plate drops far enough to matter. But there's one more thing the old photographs quietly do to us. Reg Park competed at around 215 pounds, standing 6 feet 1. Bob Peoples set his world record at 181. These were not enormous men by the standards of any modern gym floor. They were lean at a moderate body weight, with narrow waists, heavy forearms, and shoulders built by decades of physical work, photographed in hard black and white studio light that carves out every edge of a muscle. That combination reads as far bigger on a magazine page than it ever measured on a gym scale. Add a tan, a bare stage, and a photographer who knew where to put the lights. We look at those pictures, set them beside the ration book, and conclude that something close to supernatural was going on. What was going on was ordinary physiology in men built on a slightly smaller frame. So we come back to the cellar in Carter County and the question of what sat on that kitchen table. Bob Peoples was a farmer. He ate what farms in East Tennessee produced in the 1940s, which was eggs, milk, pork, cornmeal, beans, and whatever came out of the garden that week. It was plain, repetitive food with very little variety and nothing resembling a supplement. And by any modern measure, it was also a lot of food, eaten by a man burning through a working day outdoors before he ever walked down those cellar stairs. Scarcity in his story was never about calories. It was about choice. That's the part worth sitting with. The men we admire from that era weren't proving that a body needs nothing. They were proving something quieter and much harder to sell, that a small number of hard movements, repeated with total consistency across years, on plain food eaten in sufficient quantity, is enough. Nobody ever worked out how to package that, so the story got told the other way around, and the food quietly dropped out of it. Somewhere in a Minnesota archive, there are 1,300 pages describing exactly what happens to a body that really does train on almost nothing. 36 volunteers paid for that answer in a Minneapolis laboratory, and it has been sitting on the shelf ever since. waiting for anyone who wanted to check it against the legend. Set that shelf beside a kitchen table in East Tennessee, and the picture finally holds still. Maybe the question was never how these men built muscle on almost no food. Maybe it was why we needed that to be true. Everything in this video comes from the complete manual. All 6 progression ladders, exact standards for every step, and 3 full programs. It's linked in the description, and the code NOEXCUSES, one word, gets you $20 off this week. Next time, the decade when the American fitness industry tried to convince a generation of men that free weights were finished, and what it cost the ones who believed it.